So hi everyone and welcome to this month's There's More event. We want to begin by recognizing that USD is on the unceded land of the Kumeyaay Nation. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the USD community, we acknowledge this legacy, promote this balance and harmony, and find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. But past just acknowledging the land that we are on, I want to strongly encourage us all to do our own searching and learning. I implore us all to be more active in how we engage with, understand, and support the Kumeyaay people. There's More is a live storytelling event put on by the Humanity Center and Changemaker Hub. Our goal with these stories is to bring out raw, meaningful experiences of the human condition. These stories come in many different forms, such as more human, more insight, more change, and more dialogue. Every month, myself and my fellow student producer, Lily Yates, along with our wonderful faculty advisor, Diane Keeling, put together this event focusing on different and relevant themes and ideas. Although this is our first semester doing this virtually, I'd say it's going pretty well though. We then take recordings of the event, produce them, and put them out on our There's More podcast, which you can find on iTunes at There's More and on there'smore.sandiego.edu. I also want to thank our sponsors, Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Lindy Villa, who's with the Humanities Center, and Mike Williams and Juan Carlo Rivas with the Changemaker Hub. Our theme for this month's event is Mirror. This theme, like all of our themes, can usually be interpreted as the storyteller wishes it to be. This month in particular, we will be hearing from Indigenous storytellers about efforts to return Native American artifacts and bodies to their sovereign homes as part of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. That being said, let's get started with our wonderful storytellers. To begin, we have Percy Hooper Lewis of the Yomba Band of Shoshone Indians.
Hi, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. If I were to have a party, this is the party I would have. I'm looking at all the names and the faces, and I'm like, yes, this would be my guest list. So I just want to thank all the folks at the Humanities Center for helping with this event. I really appreciate this opportunity to sort of process what I've been going through a little bit. And I just really also want to thank Eva and Theresa for joining me on this as well. They're also a dream team. So when I was first invited, I was thinking, what story would I tell about NAGPRA and USD and my role in it on campus? And in the beginning, it was a lot of anger because being Native American and knowing that my university has the ancestors and the belongings and the cultural resources of tribes is heartbreaking for me. It's not anything I thought I would be working on. It's nowhere in my job description. It was never mentioned that this would be work that I would be doing. And over the past year, this work has consumed me. And I think that oftentimes people just assume because you're Native American, you know about everything Native American. And I don't know everything Native American. And one of the things that I really did not know was about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was something that I knew had been passed, but nothing that I had ever been intimately involved in. So when I was thinking, well, what am I going to say? Where do I start this story? And I think I start this story with when I met NAGPRA. Like, when did I meet NAGPRA? And I looked through my emails, and this is the email where I really met NAGPRA. Hi, Percy. All that we know about the crania is that Dr. Rogers wrote Alaska on the left temporal of each. With this paucity of information, they could belong to any ethnic group. But if the dating shows them to be prior to European arrival, then there's no question about their ethnicity. C14 data or dating and DNA analysis are the only means I know of to learn whether or not they fall under NAGPRA. So I think when you first read that, and you're a colonized person and you come from this Western world of data and information and research and materials, it makes sense, right? It's like, yes, how could we possibly know who these ancestors belong to or where they come from? They could literally be anyone if it's post contact. But when I read it as a Native person, I felt nauseous. All I could think was, it's not anybody. It can't be anybody. It's Alaska. Everybody was not in Alaska post-contact, right? There were some Russians, there were some Scandinavian sailors. Alaska was not overrun with anybody of any ethnicity, right? The only way of knowing that they could be Alaskan Native would be through some sort of scientific procedure. There's records of people going to Alaska and digging up graves. We just had a consultation, and an anthropologist up there told us that one person in particular would pull up with wheelbarrows and just fill wheelbarrows with ancestors and take them for the purpose of research. So we know that not every grave was being robbed, right? Only particular graves were being robbed. And so, you know, from an Indigenous person's perspective, I just thought, like, this is crazy. And my response back is really like, when I was horrified, I was like, I'm very disturbed and distressed that you want to destroy these ancestors to find out if they were post-contact. It just didn't make sense to me. I mean, it was just a very difficult introduction. Like, how did I meet NAGPRA as a Native person? This is how I met NAGPRA. And I think for Native people, this is how we meet NAGPRA, right? We meet it in the context of a Western viewpoint of, we may have some human remains here that were collected for the purposes of research. And we are forced to interpret that and to deal with that, and then to have to engage in the structure of the Western world to answer those questions, right? Because of course, there's no other way of knowing if these are post-contact or who they are unless you perform these scientific tests. And I think, you know, as a researcher, it also has me think about my mindset and the way that my training colonizes me to look at communities sort of in this way, right? As research subjects, as participants, as separate. You know, I'm an objective a researcher, right? Asking objective questions for the pure purpose of knowledge creation. And it makes me think, well, whose knowledge should I be allowed to find out about, right? What questions am I actually allowed to ask? In what ways am I allowed to answer those questions? Am I allowed to answer the question of, are these Alaskan Native ancestors, by conducting scientific tests that will destroy part of them? And I get, you know, I get scared, honestly. I get scared because I am a Native woman. I'm a Western Shoshone woman. That is how I have been raised. And being in an institution, I'm constantly having to remind myself of that. Because everything around me tells me that I'm just another racial group, I'm just another administrator, I'm just another faculty. And for me, you know, my motivations of being in academia are for Indian people, it's for Native people. You know, I believe that that is my purpose. And dealing with NAGPRA has been so difficult because it's made me be more the face of the university than any other job that I have ever done at USD. We met with some tribal leaders and representatives a couple of weeks ago. 13 came out of 65 that were invited because 65 nations are impacted by collections that USD holds. And I was the one being talked to like I was USD. And I was thinking, I'm not USD. You know, I am a Native woman who is so horrified by what I have found within my institution, but I feel like I have a calling to do something about it, right? Because I could say, this is not mine to deal with. It's not in my job description. This is for somebody else to deal with. But unfortunately, because NAGPRA is written, it puts the control in the hands of the institution. And if that control, not all the control, but too much of it, and if too much of that control is in the hands of the institution, I want to make sure that one of those hands is a Native hand, is a tribal hand. And that's why I do this work. That's why I continue to do it, even though it's so hard for me and requires a lot of me culturally and spiritually to do this work. But I just, you know, want to make sure that when I look in the mirror, I see a Native person. And, you know, the theme being mirrors, what do I want reflected? I want my nativeness reflected. And how do I do that? I do that by staying close to community. I do it by being in relationship with people, and especially women that are on this Zoom right now, like Geneva and Patty. I've been so fortunate to have these folks around me, and I do it by, fortunately in this work, having Eva and Theresa. And I do it by indigenizing the spaces that I come into. So to end my segment of this, I just want to honor Eva and Theresa in the way that I have been taught to honor people, and that is through song. So I'm going to sing, normally I would sing 4 rounds of this song to honor them. Today I'm going to sing 1 round. Traditionally, we stand when we honor people. I would like to ask that if you are capable of standing, that you stand to honor Eva and Theresa, because the work that they are doing, that we are doing, is difficult work. And we need support in the energy that comes through our songs, our Native songs, and our ways of honoring. So I'm a little rusty, and normally I'd have my drum, but it's a little overwhelming on Zoom. So I'm just going to sing. So I will stand as well to honor my sisters as we do this work for NAGPRA. Yo, yo, Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Percy. I think that it's amazing that you continue to fight and stay connected culturally in the face of so much adversity. It's amazing to see, and thank you for sharing the song as well. Next up, we have Eva Trujillo, who is from the Mesa Grande band of Diegueño Mission Indians. Eva, whenever you're ready.
Hauka mamir tamenyue Iwa Winechu he tekamokupai. Hello everybody, my name is Eva and I am from Tecumuk, also known as Mesa Grande, one of the 12 bands of the Kumeyaay Nation. Thank you everybody for having me here. I felt honored to be able to speak today, and I really appreciate that people came to actually hear what me, Percy, and Theresa have to say. So thank you, everybody. I wanted to start out to kind of, in the scope of NAGPRA, to kind of introduce how the Kumeyaay feel about NAGPRA and dealing with ancestors. So we refer to them as ancestors, and NAGPRA will refer to them as human remains, or an MNI, which is minimum number of individuals. Archaeology refers to them as burials, and anthropology, at times, they refer to them as specimens. But being a Kumeyaay person, we refer to them as ancestors because these are humans, and these ancestors, we descended from these ancestors, and we are alive because of these ancestors, and therefore we remember them and honor them. So when I heard about this and mirror, you know, when you look at a mirror, you kind of reflect on yourself, right? And I work as a NAGPRA coordinator in my everyday life, and have dealt with a lot of NAGPRA issues. But if I were to hold a mirror up, I would have to look at myself, and from my perspective, what NAGPRA means and how it has affected me and my community. So I wanted to tell a story, kind of it kind of puts an institution on blast, but it's all publicized, so that's okay. um, so I wanted to tell a story about an institution, UCSD. It's a university that had some of our ancestors that we requested for many years, over 20 years, in fact. The first documented correspondence is back in 2008. And mind you, NAGPRA went into effect in 1990. NAGPRA is a federal law. It protects our ancestors and lets institutions repatriate them back to us, and so then we can turn around and rebury our ancestors and take care of them. We also believe that when they're not in the ground and they're not as they've been placed, that they are suffering. So we try to end their suffering by repatriating them and reburial. So back in 2008, we had requested for our ancestors to be repatriated. And even though we had a law that says they have to repatriate our ancestors, this institution, we had continuous conversation for the next 2 years. So that takes you into like 2010. And after that, they kind of deliberated and said, on behalf of their repatriation committee, they said that the ancestors are still determined to be culturally unidentifiable, which means they couldn't culturally identify our ancestors, which they were brought up in our ancestral territory. They were brought up with artifacts which would indicate Native Americans. They were carbon dated at approximately 9,000 years BP. So common sense would tell you that these are our ancestors. But no, this institution wanted to fight. And therefore, another 2 years went by, and we had to sue them. So we ended up suing them, and in 2012, we ended up winning. I guess you could say, or we ended up with a favorable judgment to repatriate our ancestors. It had taken almost 20 years to get that judgment. And throughout those years, my community and everybody were spiritually exhausted, depleted of financial resources, all to enforce a law that was already in place. So the judge ordered for them to hand over our ancestors. And meanwhile, while all of this is going on, UCSD proceeds to transfer it to UCLA, the San Diego Museum of Man, the Natural Museum of History, Smithsonian. So they deliberately tried to keep these ancestors away from us. The ruling occurred approximately in 2014. There were professors that then turned around and wanted to sue us on top of that, which they were not successful with because of our sovereignty. But I kind of reflect and look at my community. And by the way, we didn't put our ancestors back in the ground until 2017. The ancestors were finally handed over physically in 2016. And we didn't put them back in the ground till 2017 because our community has to prepare. There is no ceremony to rebury an ancestor. So we had to then implement a ceremony that we normally would for the death of someone. But in reflecting in my journeys here, you know, our community really suffered, and so did I. I truly, truly did suffer. We mourned, we suffered all over again for those ancestors that we reburied, and the 20 years that it took to get them back, even with a law in place. But I also personally struggle representing offending institutions, which a majority of institutions are offenders. So that is a personal struggle that, as an Indigenous person, that I do have. Although I didn't personally cause this harm to my community or any other community, there's a guilt in it, because you know how much they're going to suffer and how much they are suffering. And there's no way of making that better or comforting. It's losing a loved one all over again and again and again until they can finally rebury. As an Indigenous person, I've suffered and sacrificed spiritually, as well as my community. And even though that we have a federal law in place, we are literally still fighting for ancestors today in the year 2021, which is really, really, really hard and difficult pill to swallow, I guess. But ultimately, I use this experience, this horrible experience, and mind you, this is not the first experience that I will experience with my community or anybody else's community. A lot of Indigenous communities suffer and fight for their ancestors, and they're still fighting for their ancestors 30 years after a law has passed, and they're still not made whole. But it's a struggle. It's a very hard work to do. But as Percy said, you know, who else is going to do this? You know, who else is going to give these ancestors kind hands? Who else is going to pray for these ancestors? Who else are going to mourn for them and have the motivation to actually get them home to their home community? You know, it's quite difficult work, and I admire Percy, I admire Theresa, and I admire any Indigenous person in this field and in this in NAGPRA work, because it is truly exhausting and strenuous. And like I said, it compromises our spirituality at times. So on a daily basis, that occurs. So it's very hard. It's very hard for Indigenous people to do this job. But a lot of us feel as if we've been called to this position, you know, and we're put here by the ancestors for a reason, because they need our help. So this is what drives me to get up every day and go to work and do what I do every day, because I don't want any other community to suffer the way my community has suffered. So if I can ease that pain in any way, that's something that I would always try to do. So, and I think that's it for my story.
Thank you so much, Eva. I think the fact that, as you kind of concluded with, that you're willing to put yourself into these positions of uncertainty in order to repatriate ancestors and really make them whole again, I think is amazing. Last but definitely not least, today we have Theresa of the Luiseno Tongva tribe or affiliation, and also from the University of California, San Diego. Theresa, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. Miyu Yam, Notung Theresa Ambo. I am Luiseno and Tongva, and I'm an assistant professor at that institution that Eva was just talking about. I'm an assistant professor at UC San Diego in the Department of Education Studies. A little bit about me. I grew up my entire life on my Tongva homelands in LA, and I moved to San Diego in 2017 when I finished my doctorate of education at UCLA to work at UC San Diego. I started my position as an assistant professor in 2019, and so I'm about to finish my second year. Today, I want to talk about the experience of being a Native faculty, a new Native faculty working on repatriation. And I'm going to share a story that intersects with what Percy and Eva talked about. And it is about the dehumanizing experience of being seen as a subject and a specimen by an institution. And so I want to start by saying that I'm not a stranger to repatriation work or NAGPRA. As an undergraduate at UCLA, I work for the UCLA Fowler Museum in archaeological collections where I inventoried collections for repatriation. And this is where I got my first training. Specifically, I worked on a very large collection, a private collection from the San Luis Rey River that was to be returned to the San Luis Rey Band of Mission Indians. And so through this work, I received a firsthand experience of the ways that universities collect, study, mistreat, and exploit Native people. And in this case, ancestors and cultural items and my ancestors. And so during my time at UCLA, I also had the opportunity to sit on the campus NAGPRA committee and learn about the very complex process by which the UC system and UC campuses return ancestors and cultural items to Native nations. And so my perspective doesn't come from a place of naivete or unfamiliarity, but rather this intimate relationship with repatriation, working with collections, sitting on committees, and understanding the processes that are required or a part of the repatriation process. I also want to add, because our institution was pointed out for its lack of compliance. And so while I do work for UC San Diego, I do want to clearly say that while I am in this institution, I'm not of this institution, which is a compromising place to be as a Native person being employed by institution, but I'm not a product of the institution, although I'm employed by it. And my experience too comes from the experience of being a first generation college student and now a first generation faculty. I never really had the intention of being a professor, but I firmly believe, like Percy and like Eva, that I was called to do this work for many reasons. One reason being to do repatriation work, and another reason being to support Native students. And the last being, and I firmly believe it, is to change the academy from within. And so my praxis and really how I came to do repatriation work, my praxis is to challenge settler institutions, to really challenge their legacy, their history, their practices, and so on. And so I don't sit in my office and theorize and write papers. I actually get out there and I do the work. And I have two scholars, because I am academic and I love to read, that I really look up to. And one of them is a Maori scholar, Graham Smith, and he says, you got to get your hands dirty. And so I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty. And then I would also call on the late John Lewis, who says, not to be afraid to get into good trouble. And so I don't mind also getting into some good trouble and getting my hands dirty. And I think that's how I ended up in this role as a faculty, but as someone who's doing repatriation work on campus. And so in this brief time, of a short time, right, in comparison to other people's work of doing repatriation for many decades and years. I have learned that universities are actively harming Indigenous people, and I've experienced and also witnessed the pain that's endured by generations of Indigenous people. And so this harm is not just on the ancestors that were collected by anthropologists that have different focus, but it's also harm that's being done on their descendants. And I would also add that the harm that's inflicted and endured by people, particularly Native people, is not just the Native nations and the communities that are seeking out repatriation and the return of their ancestors, but it's also on the staff and the faculty that are working on repatriation who may or may not be related. And like Eva, I also use the term ancestors as opposed to Native Americans or Native American human remains, which is used in the policy, because I also agree that our ancestors need to have this, be given reverence and respect and to be remembered. And so I really thought long about the story that I wanted to share with you all, given the time that I have and the short time that I've been at UC San Diego. And I also thought, like, what do I want other people to know about this experience of being a faculty working on repatriation? And so I would also add that given our institution's history, I am in the position where I can't share a lot legally, which is extremely compromising to not be able to speak very openly and honestly and candidly about my institution. And so I'm very careful with what I share. But I did want to share something that happened to me in January. On our campus in a laboratory in the anthropology department that has a relationship to the story that Eva shared. And so a little bit of context is important. And so something I can share is, last July, many ancestors started to emerge on our campus, and a lot of discoveries were made. And that's really all I can share at this point. But I want to share that, the ancestors started to come out, and I firmly believe this is the case, and started to be found and discovered by people on our campus because it became safe to be found. I firmly believe that our ancestors were hiding for many years because our campus wasn't in a place and wasn't ready to do the work that was necessary. And within the last 2 years, 5 Indigenous faculty have come to UC San Diego, and they have the ethic and the commitment and the responsibility to ensure that our ancestors are taken care of and repatriated and returned to their nations, to their families. And so this particular discovery was found in the lab of my colleague and friend, Keolu Fox, who's Kanaka Maoli, and he promptly reported it. And, our institution is working on addressing repatriation with regard to this specific place. And the story that I wanted to share with you all, and how I started this about this dehumanizing experience of being a subject or a specimen to your institution, happened specifically to me in January. I had to go into a lab because this particular lab, because maintenance is going to be taking place, and they're going to be running e-power to this laboratory as standard maintenance. And I am one of 2 people on our campus that are able to allow this lab to be open because it's locked and secured because of everything that was discovered in the laboratory. And when I went into the lab, I had never been into it before, and so I was trying to get oriented and acquainted and see what was where. understanding that ancestors from across the country were located in this lab. And I walked over to a desk because there was a small box on the desk. And, you know, I could see there was a plastic bag in there, crumbled up, an older bag. And I picked it up. And in the bag was a mandible of a person. And then, which was shocking enough because, you know what you're entering into, you know that there's ancestors in the lab, but you never really are ready or prepared to see what I saw, to see a mandible of a person. And so, you know, I was shocked. And then I kind of folded the bag up a little bit more, and I saw a tag in the bag. And the tag said Malibu, and it had some numberings on it. And I had the realization in the moment that this is my ancestor that I'm holding in my hand. And it was wrapped up in a bag in a dirty office that's disorganized. And it hadn't been cared for properly. And it was just laying there. And I also had the realization that our institution either doesn't care what is within these laboratories or is more concerned with the ability for people to research Native people, either through carbon dating or measuring or what have you. And I had a realization that there's more value placed on an ancestor or even me inside a box than there is for me as a human being and as a faculty in our institution. And it was just jarring. It was incredibly dehumanizing to have a recognition that there could be disregard and a deprioritization of repatriation and following a federal and a state and a system law so that our ancestors could be studied over, you know, a respect and a prioritization of the needs of Indigenous people or our communities. And so I just share that story with you all to share, you know, these are things that faculty and staff and students are going through on a regular basis. They're happening on our campus, and they're incredibly dehumanizing experiences where the value that's placed on research supersedes the value that is often placed on an individual person who's present within the academy, from my perspective anyhow. And so, you know, that's one of a story that I wanted to share with you all today. And I have been really fortunate to work with Percy and Eva on another collection, the Hubs collection, that was affiliated with our university. And so something I do want to share, because I don't want to end on such a negative note, because I do understand that, you know, it is really sad to hear that kind of story, is working with Eva and Percy has been such an incredible gift. And, you know, I haven't been for a while, but, you know, for weeks, every Tuesday, I'd sit across from Eva and we'd go through boxes and do inventories. And the work is physically, it's mentally, and it's spiritually exhausting. Every box you open, you have the possibility of opening something that might contain an ancestor. And then as you go through boxes, you find other things. And I would say the most rewarding, the most healing thing, that the item that I have come across is a fish hook from the Channel Islands, which is territory that my people share with the Chumash. And you know, opening up these boxes and going through items and being able and writing an Excel line for each item and each bag and each shell that you find. You know, it's a lot of work, but then on occasion you'll come across a bead, you'll come across a shell. And so one day I came across a fish hook, and to be able to hold something in your hand that your ancestor made, and to be able to see the brilliance and the technical training that is required to make a fish hook out of an abalone shell that's curved and notched. You know, it does make it makes the painful experiences and those particular challenges not rewarding. That's not the right word, but I think it diminishes the pain that you experience when you have those negative experiences, interactions, and to be able to see it, to feel it, to touch it, it does help, and it is healing in a certain way. And so that's really the note that I want to end on.
Thank you so much, Theresa, and thank you so much, Percy and Eva as well, for sharing all of your stories. I wanted to once again thank Percy, Eva, and Theresa for sharing your experiences, stories, and all the work that you have done and continue to do each and every day. With that, I want to conclude this event. Thank you all so much for coming and for your insights, and I hope that we all learned something today.